You're fired. 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 You're fired.
But Emily, you are not fired.
You might recognize that scary voice.
Exactly. It just shows that careers are long and people do lots of different things. But we're not here to talk about that. What we are here to talk about is the heavier topic of how to conduct a reduction of force when you do a group of people that are being fired, and what are the best practices in conveying the message and making sure you're legally compliant. So listen in.
You're fired.
Welcome to Hiring to Firing, the podcast. I'm Tracey Diamond, a labor and employment partner with Troutman Pepper Locke, and I'm here with my co-host and partner, Emily Schifter. Together, we tackle all employment issues from hiring to firing.
Today, we are thrilled to welcome as our guest Lauren Tilashalski. Lauren actually started her career as an attorney here at Troutman. Today, she is Senior Associate General Counsel at Global Payments, focusing on labor and employment. And in her spare time, she shares her thoughts, insights, and I have to say, always spot-on recommendations on books, fashion, travel, home decor, music, and more online. I highly recommend her weekly Lauren letter. So welcome, Lauren. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your current role, and Global Payments?
Thank you guys so much for having me. It is great to be back, especially like you mentioned, Emily. I did start my career here at Troutman. Yep, these days I am Senior Associate General Counsel at Global Payments. We are a worldwide fintech company that's headquartered in Atlanta. And I support both domestic and international HR teams and business stakeholders on everything in what we call the employee lifecycle, which, as we will talk about today, can sometimes feel like reality TV. I always joke that this was the perfect practice area for me to pursue because I do love my reality TV. And then, yes, as you mentioned, in my free time, I also create content and I share stories on my Instagram and Substack page called The Lauren Letter, if you ever want a break from some employment law content.
That sounds so fun, and I'm definitely going to check out the Lauren letter. Today, we're going to focus on a little bit of a heavier topic than that, which is the topic of reductions in force, or as we call RIFs for short, layoffs and employee terminations. And so to make that somewhat heavy topic a little more fun, as we always do, we're going to pull examples from TV shows. And in this case, it's Emily's favorite, which is reality TV shows. So what do RIFs and reality television have in common? Well, many of these shows thrive on structured eliminations. If you think about it, right? Many reality TV shows are really a structured reduction in force, or a mini reduction in force. And that brings us to our first clip. And this one's from one of the longest running reality shows out there, The Bachelor. In this show, of course, a group of suitors vie for the affections of the Bachelor, or sometimes the Bachelorette, with the group getting progressively smaller after weekly dates and cocktail parties. And as much as I'm not so much of a reality TV fan, I have to say I've been sucked in by The Bachelor on more than one occasion.
It's hard not to be.
Every episode ends with an elimination, the famous rose ceremony. Those contestants or suitors that are chosen to stick around another week are given a rose by the Bachelor or Bachelorette, and anyone left standing empty-handed must take a moment and say their goodbyes. Have you guys seen the one that's at like a resort? I forget what it's called, but it's like, Bachelor in Paradise. That was the last one that I was obsessed with.
Yes.
All right. So let's take a listen to one example. This one's from season 27 of the show featuring Zach Shallcross as the Bachelor.
Hey, ladies. Wow. This was a whirlwind of a week. It's a little overwhelming at times. And, I think every single one of you women really did show me a lot about yourselves. And I can't thank you enough for doing that. Davia, will you accept this rose?
Yes, thank you. I would love to just have another week just to see what could be.
Mercedes, will you accept this rose?
Of course. I genuinely feel like we could really have a great connection and a great relationship, but I don't think he's really given me a chance.
Bailey, will you accept this rose?
Of course.
Ladies, Zach, it's the final roast tonight.
In The Bachelor, everyone knows the rose ceremony is coming, but in real workplaces, employees often feel blindsided when a layoff or reduction in force happens. What's an employer's legal obligation to give advance notice of a separation or a layoff?
Right. So let's start with the WARN Act. The WARN Act actually exists both at the federal level and the state level. And the idea is advance notice. So under federal law, employers with 100 or more employees generally have to give 60 days notice before a plant closing or a mass layoff. This can look like closing a facility entirely or laying off at least 50 employees at a single site when that's a third or more of the workforce, or 500 or more employees, regardless of the percentage. The tricky part is that the WARN Act has look-back periods, 30 days, 90 days. So even layoffs that happen in waves can sometimes be aggregated and compel those requirements. That's really where I can see employers getting caught off guard.
I see a lot of people make that mistake of thinking, oh, we'll just do, a bunch of 40-person layoffs maybe,
Yeah.
or they don't even think about the fact we've done several in the last 6 months. And
Yeah, exactly. So you have to be really considerate about, again, those look back periods. And it's also important to know when WARN does and doesn't apply, because it really isn't always intuitive. For example, part-time employees, those who work under 20 hours a week, or who've been employed for less than 6 months in the past year, generally do not count toward WARN threshold. On the flip side, a reduction in pay or a temporary furlough might still trigger WARN if it's long enough in duration or significant enough financially. And there are a few exceptions, things like unforeseen business circumstances, that pretty little term of art, but employers really need to proceed with caution there. It can be very hard to prove that the situation truly raised to that threshold of unforeseeable. And the burden, of course, will be on the employer to show that. Of course, individual terminations generally don't require notice under WARN, at least in the United States, but some executive level employment agreements can create similar obligations. For example, an agreement might require advance notice of termination or provide for severance or garden leave in lieu of notice. And then, so aside from federal law, we have our mini WARNs for states. New Jersey's version recently expanded coverage and requires severance payments in addition to notice. And then other states like New York, Illinois, California, they all have their own unique rules and definitions. Speaking of our dear friend in the employment law world, California, there are important legal updates coming in 2025. California WARN is soon expanding coverage to remote employees, and they're clarifying the counting rules to make clear that hybrid or home-based workers that are still tied toward facility counts are still tied to this facility count 50 employee threshold. It's also expected that it's going to tighten employer obligations around notice and timing. There's going to be new civil penalty provisions for noncompliance. So if you have employees anywhere in California, even if they're remote, it's really worth paying close attention to those changes. And then finally, even if your state doesn't have a mini WARN Act, there still can be other notification requirements. For example, I'm here in Georgia. My company is headquartered in Atlanta. And in this state, we have to notify the unemployment office of larger reductions so that the state can proactively deploy those benefits.
Yeah, you've hit on a lot of important topics there. And WARN Act is such a complex statute. And I just want to sort of highlight a couple of things that you said. One is the New Jersey WARN Act. I practice in New Jersey, and it's a real surprise to my New Jersey clients that there's this mandatory severance obligation, and it can be quite costly to employers in New Jersey. The threshold is also fairly low for what triggers a mini WARN Act obligation under New Jersey. And then that concept of a remote workforce and how do you count that worker for purposes of WARN has really had a lot of clients scratching their heads over how do I count? Who counts for what facility? I think, WARN Act wasn't written with the concept of COVID and remote work becoming such an important part of the workplace generally, and applying an older law like we've seen with so many other laws, right, to the new world can sometimes be really difficult and complex to do.
I think that's exactly right. And the counting rules are so complicated anyway. So when you add in the uncertainty of we've got remote people and the cases in the law really haven't kept up
And hybrid, the whole other gray area.
It's had another layer, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Very complex. So moving on to our next clip from another beloved classic, The Great British Bake Off. This show, of course, is a baking competition that pits amateur bakers against each other over various rounds, with one contestant eliminated each round until a winner is selected. So let's take a listen to an episode from series 12 of the show, where in a controversial decision, contestant Jürgen Kraus was eliminated during the semifinals, despite having won 3-star baker accolades during the season. So let's listen to the judges deliberate who should go home.
Wow. There are 4 really impressive bakers in this tent. I do not envy you the task of having to separate them.
What's almost unique, we're picking the worst of the best.
It really is difficult because all of them tasted fantastic. Christelle, I mean, look at the layers in that. The coconut biscuit.
The glaze is stunning.
And Chigs, look at the amount of skill in that. I mean, there's a biscuit, there's a crumble, there's a wonderful chocolate case, which is not easy to do.
Jürgen was clever with the matcha and the raspberry.
A bit boring to look at.
And then you come down to Giuseppe.
My only complaint with this, I love the beautiful glaze and the colour, and the cherry is fantastic. My only complaint, I couldn't taste the pineapple.
So we're in a very unusual position where...
You could argue for any one of these.
This is the worst time to go home as well, so it's horrible.
Yes, it is. It's really hard.
I don't know how you're going to make this decision.
In Bake Off, someone can go home even when they're really good, sometimes because there's a lot of good people to choose from and it's a tough competition, or sometimes because the judges just sort of feel like somebody else needs to stay.
Or because it makes for good television.
Well, that's exactly right. Which is the funniest part of these clips. You have to find a clip that doesn't just involve a lot of dramatic pauses with the music swelling up. But this was a particularly hard decision for the judges, as we heard. And it was also a shocking elimination for the show. There were even, I think, over 150 complaints submitted to the network of people who were devastated about his elimination. So, Lauren, why can gut feel be so dangerous legally in a RIF?
And I'll say I am a huge Bake Off fan. It is my favorite comfort content in the fall. And I was very upset about Jürgen eliminating. I'll leave it to the listeners and you guys to decide whether I was one of the complaints that were formally submitted or not. But again, yeah, your point about the danger of gut feelings being dangerous, this hits close, I think, for HR folks and employment lawyers across the board. In reductions in force, just like in the Great British Bake Off, someone can be eliminated even when they've performed really well, all because of a gut feel. And we really want to avoid that subjectivity. That is something I actively counsel my internal clients, and when I was in private practice, my clients at that time, every single day. And it's especially risky in a reduction in force. My counsel is always across the board focusing on objective, documented criteria. Let's look at things consistently for our entire decisional unit. Things like performance ratings, skill set, tenure, business function. If you find yourself relying on intuition, subjective manager preference, even without nefarious intent, you still run the risk of disparate impact. That's where a seemingly neutral process is disproportionately affecting a protected group. And that will subject your client or your company to liability. And that's why, again, the best approach is setting that clear, consistent criteria, keyword here, up front, before any decisions are made. And again, before decisions are made, have HR, have legal review that selection data and that criteria before you make any decision.
Yeah, under the current administration, the EEOC has publicized that they're no longer going to look at a disparate impact form of discrimination. Yeah. But to your point, Lauren, there's still state law that you have to be concerned about. So
absolutely.
And an employee could still sue, even though the EEOC might not be as an entity looking at it from an audit perspective.
Absolutely.
Okay, so of course, most of our listeners are likely familiar with the special considerations relevant to individuals protected by the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, what's required under the Age Discrimination and under the Older Worker Benefits Protection Act in particular, when offering severance to older employees, those over age 40, which is really not all that old, but is older, I suppose. So how do you ensure that those releases are enforceable?
I like to use the word seasoned or of a better vintage.
I don't know. There's just no good way of saying it.
Fair enough. As we discussed a little bit earlier related to mini WARN Acts too, a lot of times with reductions in force, we're going to see employers offering severance pay in exchange for a release of claims, meaning that the employee is going to take the severance pay in agreement to not sue the company for things like discrimination, wrongful termination. But when the employee is 40 or older, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, or the ADEA, and its amendment, Older Workers Benefit Protection Act, OWBPA, they add in special rules that need to be considered. And the goal really of these pieces of legislation is to ensure that the older workers are giving up their rights knowingly and voluntarily. So what that means is there's going to be very specific technical requirements to make that release enforceable. So let's look at it in kind of two camps: individual terminations and then reductions in force. The first being individual terminations. The release needs to be in writing. It has to be clear, understandable language, no legal jargon. And again, I would recommend that for any severance agreement, but it is explicitly required here. It specifically also has to reference the right under the ADEA. You can't just have a general catch-all claims release. You have to give the employee at least 21 days to consider the agreement. And then even after signing, they get a 7-day revocation period. Turning now to a group layoff or a reduction in force, the OWBPA takes it even a step further. So employers are going to have to provide detailed disclosure so the employees can really see the broader context. So things like which job titles and organizational units were included in the layoff, the ages of those selected for termination, and the ages of those not selected. In that group setting, employers have to give 45 days to consider the release instead of just the individual 21. And it really is important mentioning that you can't just skip these technicalities. If the agreement doesn't check every single one of these boxes, it is fully and wholly invalid as to the age claims, even if the employee signed it, even if they cashed their severance check. So it is extremely important that HR and legal coordinate early to make sure that any templates comply for the release, especially in the context of a reduction in force. The bottom line is releases are doable. You can extinguish liability. They just need to be handled carefully, transparently, and with precision.
I think that's right. I think it catches people by surprise sometimes if they haven't dealt with it a lot. They're surprised that it starts at age 40. They're surprised that, a group under the ADEA can be really just more than one.
Yeah.
And they're surprised about the additional time required. So you're right. Having legal and HR involved early can help make it a lot smoother. There's fewer surprises.
Yeah. And from a lift perspective, these requirements take a long time to organize and make sure they're accurate. So just from processes standpoint, making sure you're building in time for your HR teams, your shared support teams to be able to get those compliant measures prepared and ready to be disclosed to the employees receiving severance agreements it takes a while.
Another area that is relatively new in certain states is that for confidentiality provisions within separation agreements to be enforceable, employees who are even under age 40 need to be given at least 21 days to sign.
Mm-hmm.
And that 21 days isn't always waivable the way it is for the Age Discrimination Act. So the employee can't choose to sign earlier. That's an issue in New York, I know. And that's take a lot of clients by surprise too. So make sure you know your state law.
Absolutely. So speaking of severance on TV, those who are cut usually end up empty-handed, like the Bachelor contestants without a rose, or Top Chef candidates who are told to pack their knives and go, or Project Runway contestants who are told one day you're in and the next day you're out.
All right, Emily, you're watching a lot of reality TV.
But in the employment context, Lauren, as you mentioned, of course, if we're trying to get a release of claims, we're going to offer some kind of severance as consideration for that release. Obviously, the most common method is monetary payments, whether that's a lump sum or if it's salary continuation, so to speak, continuing over time. But sometimes employers will add in other components, like they might cover some or all of the cost of COBRA benefits continuation coverage, support outplacement services, accelerate vesting of stock options, or pay out some or all of the annual bonus that might not have otherwise been payable. How can employers communicate severance fairly or design these packages in a way to avoid the perception that it's simply hush money?
Absolutely. It's a really important consideration. And severance is one of those areas where it's not always a easy one size fits all answer. For example, some employers are going to have formal ERISA covered severance plans. Others will handle it more informally. But even when it's discretionary, severance, you want to use a consistent formula. So, for example, going with 2 weeks of pay for every year of service with a minimum and a maximum in place so that it feels fair and consistently defensible. Communication is going to matter too. Like you said, Emily, you want employees to understand that this is not hush money. It's about supporting people through a transition. The message can come through in what is being offered, whether it's COBRA coverage, outplacement services, or even something personalized like offering a neutral reference or limiting the terms of a non-compete. Within the context of all of that, one more point, and Tracey, you actually touched on this just briefly before, state law is increasingly stepping into this space as well. For example, we're seeing things like the limitation on confidentiality clauses in severance agreements. You can't automatically require your team members to keep the terms a secret, which again does not necessarily help with wanting to communicate that this isn't hush money. So make sure that you have state addendums included, ensuring that you are clear about what terms do or do not apply in certain jurisdictions.
So you touched on this a little bit, but what practical advice do you have for HR teams when they're preparing their separation agreements, their WARN notices, and any other documentation they need for a layoff so that they can minimize confusion and also mitigate risk?
Absolutely. I mean, from a documentation standpoint, start early if you can. The more lead time you have, just the more thoughtful and organized your process will be. And this is particularly where that strong relationship between HR, legal, and the business really pays off. If the trust and value is there, HR and legal are going to be in a better position to see these things coming and advise. For example, honestly, from the outset, legal can help analyze the balance of cost saving versus personnel reductions versus the risk of not securing severance agreements and shielding the company from liability. I touched on this early, but I'm going to reemphasize it. WARN notices are deceptively simple. They look like they're form letters. I understand why they look like they're form letters, but the content requirements are extremely exacting. So please, please, please have counsel review. And then again, from the practical side, having and maintaining ready to go template, separation agreements, benefit summaries, PTO payout letters where that's applicable, manager scripts, FAQs, things like that, that of course you need to edit, you need to tweak, you need to update as state, federal law, regulation is updated. But having those kind of in place so that if a reduction happens, you can scale up quickly and consistently. And from my perspective, most importantly, compliantly.
So aside from the documentation, are there any particular logistics you recommend for HR teams to think about when preparing to communicate the RIF?
Yeah. And so this is honestly where I would say meeting humanity. It matters just as much what the separation messages say as how it's delivered. So being clear, concise, empathetic, that is really going to be a driving point for those communications.
So that brings us to our last clip. And maybe because it just makes for good TV, but reality shows often have dramatic goodbyes after a departure decision has been made, or emotional, anguished decisions, cue the music, of who to eliminate. So in this clip from the singing competition show The Voice, Ariana Grande, one of the coaches on the show, struggles to the point of tears because she was overwhelmed by the difficult decision of having to choose one of her team members to eliminate. Let's take a listen.
It also leaves our brand new coach, Ariana Grande, whose first live show was last night. And I know how tough this moment is for you, Ari. You are so vested in your team. You can see the emotions on your face.
I don't know.
Hold on, everybody.
I don't know how this possibly could have happened. I know everyone is equally as, I don't have any idea what to say. You all are so brilliant and the most incredible vocalists and human beings I've had the privilege of getting to know and work with. I will be here as a friend and a mentor if you want. I'm a FaceTime away every day forever. I love you all so much and respect you forever. Oh my God, this is hell. Oh my
All
God.
right, take a breath.
I love you so much. Oh my gosh. The person I'm gonna take with me to the next round is Riley.
So while some of that seems made for TV, there are absolutely real emotions involved in separating employees in the real world too, for sure. I want to emphasize that because it is, we're all human and it is as hard as it is to hear that bad news, and it is really can be devastating for folks. It's really hard to give that news as well. So how should employers manage that? And how can they communicate separation decisions in a way that is both respectful to employees and also avoids legal risk?
Absolutely. You need to be prepared for difficult conversations. I think it's helpful to have those scheduled at consistent times so that you have a consistent place of messaging as opposed to what I like to refer to as the rumor mill, the cobblestone telegraph, whatever your euphemism of choice is. And again, you might experience heightened emotions from both the survivors and those who have been released. From a practical standpoint, preparing, if necessary, to have IT cut off access to systems, timing it carefully, again, so that there's not confusion. And then also, I touched on it briefly, but don't forget about the survivors. Again, we want to communicate with empathy, with clarity to those who have been impacted. We want to be compassionate without saying things like, I know this isn't fair, anything that implies liability. But it also is, I'm not going to say just as important, but it is valid nonetheless, less that we are intentional with the employees who remain. How leadership communicates going forward will shape morale. It will shape trust. It also has a potential implication on liability exposure. So just continuing to consistently reinforce the company's direction and stability going forward, again, without any sort of editorializing on the substance of decision-making, or I should say the subjective criteria that you may impugn upon decision-making. Stay away from that. Clear, concise, with an eye toward the future.
And I think you're so right about just being prepared can help a lot with the emotions and also with how you deliver things, thinking about IT or how are you going to let people go, well, I put my lunch in the office fridge, and thinking through, so I'm on vacation today and, or I have a sick day and just sort of thinking through how you're going to handle all of that leaves you a little bit less flat-footed and able to, I think, stick to the rational script.
And from a legal counsel's perspective, that's a great time to lean on your HR business partners, asking them to proactively identify if members of the impact list are on leave, are utilizing PTO, if they're going to be in the office or working remotely. Again, by having that information ahead of time, you can make conscious, intentional decisions that are going to make the experience as positive as it can be for the employer and, candidly, the impacted team member.
So this has been a really helpful, informative conversation for our listeners, and we really appreciate your time today and joining us with Lauren. It was so nice to meet you.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. I love being a Troutman alumni, and so it's always fun to get to come back and keep in touch with the firm and talk about my favorite thing ever, employment law.
And reality TV.
And reality TV.
And thank you to all our listeners for listening in. Feel free to shoot us an email, suggest some topics, let us know about your favorite TV shows and movies. And we hope to bring you great new content in the future. Thanks so much for listening.
Copyright Troutman Pepperlock, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman does not make any representations or warranties, expressed or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper Locke. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.